Did you grow up going to drive-in movies? And do you ever wonder whatever happened to them? Hi, I'm that history lady. I share stories from the past that keep history alive. If you like what I do, be sure to subscribe. Drive-in movies are enjoying a little bit of a comeback during the pandemic. But whatever happened to them? Why'd they disappear in the first place? And why were they so crazy popular at one point? Let's take a look. Movies and automobiles grew up together. They both emerged in wild popularity in the mid 1890s. And we have stories from the earliest days of silent films of people watching movies outside, sometimes even in their cars, on screens that they would stretch between trees or set up on beaches. But it wasn't until the early 1930s that someone came up with the idea of a purpose-built drive-in movie theater. And that was this guy, Richard Hollingshead Jr. He worked as a sales manager for his father's auto parts company in Camden, New Jersey. He knew automobile culture and he knew about the freedom and independence that cars embodied. His mother, he noticed, had a hard time sitting in traditional indoor movie theater seats. So he nailed a screen to a couple of trees in his backyard, set up a film projector, probably one that looked like this, on the hood of his car, put up a speaker behind the screen so she could watch in comfort from the car. It was a brilliant idea. So what if he brought in other cars, not just one or two, but a whole theater's worth? He experimented with some ramps and other ideas and finally came up with this idea of a sort of graded ramp system that would park cars at different heights, giving everyone a clear view of the screen. He patented that idea in May of 1933, and 1 month later, he opened the world's first auto theater in Camden, New Jersey. He advertised it as a private theater box for your car. And can you see the price here? 25 cents per car and per person. He had no idea if anyone would actually show up, and they did. Some 600 people packed his lot to see a year-old British comedy called Wives Beware with Adolphe Menjou. And it didn't take very long for others to catch on that this was a really innovative new idea. Other theaters slowly started to emerge. Shankweller's opened about a year later. This is near Allentown, Pennsylvania. And as you can see from this image, it's still in operation today. And a few others opened over the next few years. But Hollingshead didn't profit much. His patent failed to protect his idea. He actually sold his Camden Theater just 2 years after he opened it. But the idea had taken root. For theater owners, it was all about the cost. Most drive-ins throughout their history were mom and pop businesses, and they really didn't require much more than putting up a big screen and a projection booth and grading the land. And in an era when land on the outskirts of towns was pretty cheap, starting a drive-in was often a pretty inexpensive proposition. Add in some sales of homemade popcorn in paper bags, sell some bottled soda, and you're set. The growth of these early theaters was hampered by just one big problem: the sound. To reach the far back rows, early drive-ins relied on enormous speakers, which annoyed neighbors living near the drive-in theater and left patrons in the far back rows with distracting sound delays. Then in 1941, RCA came up with the perfect solution: in-car speakers. Individual speakers that patrons could mount right onto their car doors and adjust to their own preferred volume level. No noise pollution, no sound delays. And with that necessary innovation, drive-in movies exploded in popularity. By the late 1950s and the early 1960s, drive-in movies were everywhere. At the peak of the drive-in movies' popularity in 1958, there were 4,063 drive-ins in the United States. That accounted for about 1/4 of all American movie theaters at the time. And they were always easy to spot because they had these tall screen towers that provided space for these colorful, often local murals. And at nighttime, many of them had wonderful flashing neon lights. But what exactly made drive-ins so popular with patrons? Well, to put it simply, it was comfort and privacy. Unlike indoor movie theaters where you had to dress up, you could come as you were for a drive-in movie. Big cars of that era provided a lot more space to spread out than a tiny movie theater did. So you could really stretch out. You could bring the baby, you could bring noisy kids along. Don't have to worry if they get noisy. Don't have to worry about hiring a babysitter. You could talk, you could smoke, you could eat peanuts. And more than that, drive-in theaters were social. Many drive-in theaters lured in families by offering amenities like playgrounds. Many of them had tiny little kiddie trains that would ride around, or boats that kids could drive around in before the feature. Some of them had animal shows and other things as special events. Many of them really started to take on the feel of a county fair. Patrons would come a little bit early, to hang out, to play, have some free time before the movie started. And then, of course, there were the ultra-modern concession stands by the 1940s. These were really fun.
Refreshment time, folks. Time out for a delicious snack in our sparkling refreshment building.
This was a whole dinner out for the family, meaning a whole evening.
Sizzling hamburgers grilled to your taste. How about a pizza? None better anywhere.
Now, there were some drawbacks to running a drive-in theater, of course. Many of them were forced to close in the winter or try to eke out the season.
All new hotshot electric in-car heaters have been installed for your comfort and convenience. Just insert heater through car window and turn on the switch.
In summertime, you might have to contend with rain or bugs.
Men, there's a drive-in movie full of juicy people. Wow!
Concession stands always sold things like Pick mosquito repellent coils and Drizzle Guard auto rain visor extenders to help patrons cope with these elements outside. Some problems were actually much harder, though, to overcome. Unlike indoor theaters, which could show movies 5-6 times a day, drive-ins could only show films in the evening, after dusk. Then in the 1950s arrived the television. These flickering little home boxes of entertainment gave families a way to enjoy the same thing they got at the drive-in, but at home. Comfort, privacy, but no bugs, no rain, no extra cost for food, no hassle. Drive-in movies really started to see their family audiences slip away, but they remained enduringly popular with another audience segment. Can you guess what I'm thinking? Teenagers. Inexpensive drive-ins remained perfect for cash-strapped teens wanting to get together outside their parents' home. It was not uncommon, you might remember, for teenagers to sometimes hide an extra friend or two in the trunk to save a few extra pennies. And for couples, cars offered privacy that they couldn't get at home, which led to some consternation from theater owners. Movies shown at the drive-ins were pretty soon appealing directly to the teenage audience. They were starting to feature low-budget films that featured young people frolicking on the beach or monsters terrorizing the earth. Titles got steadily more gory, promising things like A Tower of Screaming Virgins or The Blood-Splattered Bride. Movies featuring this kind of gore and sex, they did turn off a lot of the family-oriented consumers, but they kept drive-ins busy for a long time after they stopped being considered as primarily a family activity. In the 1970s, however, watching movies from your car became a lot less comfortable. During the oil crisis, many Americans swapped out those big, comfortable cars for smaller economy models, cars which cost significantly less to drive, but they also had less space to stretch out. And by this era, many drive-ins that were built in the 40s and 50s were really starting to show their age, but few of them had money to do any big upgrades. Increasingly, drive-ins found themselves forced to rent out space during the daytime for flea markets or for church services just to stay afloat. The primary challenge, though, for drive-ins by the 1980s was real estate. As cities grew, So did property values. An effective drive-in needs at least 15 acres of land. The increasingly high cost of land curbed the growth of drive-in theaters as far as land was concerned. And many drive-ins started to close because the land was more valuable to real estate developers for malls or multi-use complexes. That, combined with the growing number of indoor theaters and then the rise of video rental sales, that was the death knell for many drive-in theaters. Today, you can still find ruins of former drive-ins all over the United States. More than 98% of our movie screens today are at indoor theaters. Only about 320 drive-in movie theaters are left in the United States. That's actually down from just under 600 in 1995. And yet, many are still betting on the survival of the drive-in, especially as pandemic fears encourage social distancing. Drive-in theaters today, they can accommodate big audiences, and the sound comes in crystal clear because it's usually projected nowadays through your car radio. Movie screens today are enormous. They're as big as 60 by 80 feet at a drive-in. We don't think about drive-ins as offering private theater boxes today, but in the world of pandemics, a private space in your car is desirable for a very different reason than it was 90 years ago when drive-in movie theaters first began. I wonder if this revival of drive-in movie theaters that we're seeing during the pandemic is going to help a lot of Americans rediscover how much fun it is to watch movies under the stars. It reminds me of a lot of other little slices of retro Americana, something that was a real favorite in history in the early 20th century in this case, continues to exert a really surprising hold on the American imagination. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like what I do, don't forget to subscribe.